I will share my slides now. And thank you for the opportunity to speak about something that really across the Irish university systems, we are trying to make the norm. We're trying to make it something that is just the way that we do things. I've called the presentation Engaged Research because this is a term that you are going to hear more and more. And my colleague in the Irish Universities Association, Kate Morris, will paint that much larger landscape in order to show you why engaged research will become so fundamentally important as a way of understanding the research that we do. And what I'll be doing is I'll be zoning in on public and patient involvement in research, which is the area that I'm interested in, and how that interacts and intersects with engaged research. So first, what I'd like to do is to talk very briefly about engaged research, which obviously Kate will be looking into in much more detail. But I'll be borrowing Kate's definition of engaged research to show you what we mean by that. And it is very much about describing the wide range of research applications and methodologies that share a common interest in collaboration with societal partners. And as you can see, it is about improving and understanding and investigating an issue of public interest and concern. So what we're talking about are the big societal challenges. But what's fundamental about engaged research and also about public and patient involvement, it's advancing this with societal partners rather than for them. And when we talk about societal partners, what we are talking about, as you can see there, they are the people who use services, who use products, but also civil and civic society. We're talking about the public sector, we're talking about industry partners, we're talking about the interested public and all kinds of relevant stakeholders. Now, I know that the HSE has a really useful guide in terms of engaging with stakeholders, but I always like to use this diagram as a way of reminding ourselves about the scope of who stakeholders are. People often talk about stakeholders, but actually they don't necessarily mean the same people. So I always think it's really useful to be able to identify who it is you're talking about when you're talking about stakeholders. And this diagram from the National Coordinating Centre for Public Engagement in the UK breaks it down into the general public, who of course are never just general. Publics exist in all kinds of different contexts. The civil society, business, and the public sector. And what I really like about this diagram is that it shows how these different categories bleed into each other, but that the resources that the HSE have up on your research and development website really help you to try and identify who your stakeholders are and how potentially you can engage them and how you can work with them. So then, as I've promised, really what I want to do is I want to zone in on public and patient involvement, which is the area that I work in called PPI. And just to clarify, because this is often a question that comes up, when we talk about public and patient involvement in research, we're not necessarily talking about people who being the subjects of a study. Now, being the subject of a study is really very often very altruistic work, and people giving of their time and their data and their information is actually very altruistic, and research really can't exist without participants. But that's not what we're talking about when we talk about involvement. Also, what we're not talking about is people going and giving public lectures on what they found or distributing the details of the research that they've done. We would call that engagement. But what we are talking about when we talk about involvement are patients and members of the public and carers and people with a stake in the good quality of the patient outcomes, working in partnership, being at the research table where the plans are made, where the designs are drawn up, where things are managed, how things are evaluated and disseminated, and ultimately moving towards a pathway to impact. Um, the other part to it is that there is a growing body of research about the actual practical benefits of public and patient involvement. But I always like to remind people that actually this is driven by belief. And the belief is that people who are directly affected by things are, they actually have a right to influence them. As well as that, the public are often the people who are actually funding this research, either through tax or through donations, and that it is important that there is a kind of a public oversight, if you like, on what is being funded in health and medical research. But also, I think and as somebody who's been involved in the disability sector for a long time, and people will recognize that phrase, that nothing about us without us, that there is an equity issue here around people who are so often excluded and multiply excluded because of, the wider determinants of health, actually having a say and being included in this as a process in a way that is appropriate to them. As I said, funders do want it, and it's quite clear within the various funding strands and the various funding agencies, such as NGO funders, public funders, and European funders, that you can see within the work that they are doing that they have developed very sophisticated ways of ensuring and encouraging and providing oversight to how funding is being spent. And I know Kate will probably talk about at that European level, that at a European level, really, that they are looking for the quadruple helix, which is about involving citizens, the public sector, businesses, and also academia together in what is funded at a European level. And at a universities level as well, we now have the BPI Ignite network. So many of the universities now have people such as myself working in order to develop the structures and infrastructure that is required in order to support patients and members of the public to play a full and active role in meaningful and equitable ways. And we're working with lots of really great partners in that, such as yourselves, Health Research Charities Ireland, IPOSI, TUSLA, and the ICPHR, Sphere, and TMRN as well as Campus Engage, of course. But the other part to this is, and a question that often comes up, is talking about why patients get involved. And sometimes researchers are a little bit reluctant because they worry, particularly if they're lab-based research, they worry that patients are only getting involved because they want a cure tomorrow for whatever it is that they are living with. And actually, that hasn't been my experience a lot of the time. Somebody put a call out on Twitter at one point saying, I'm doing a presentation tomorrow, and can anybody give me some reasons why they get involved? And so I have this screen grab because it really struck a chord with what my experience has been of listening to patients and members of the public. That actually what they're trying to do is they're trying to make some meaning from what has been a very tough and difficult situation. And what they're also trying to do is they're trying to make sure that they're not condemning the next generation to experiencing that as well. And the other part to it is, and I really love this explanation as well by another patient, is that they have a sophisticated view about the fact that they don't know everything. They are experts in their own lives and in living with the condition that they have. They don't see themselves and they don't consider themselves to be the person who knows everything. They see themselves as a voice and a way of knowing that is helpful to work with clinicians, to work with people with a research background who understand methodology and epistemology. They don't see themselves as that, but they do see themselves as having a really useful and important role to play. And the other part to it is, even though we'll be focusing on the impact side of things, that what we're talking about is patients playing a role at all kinds of different levels. And that the Health Research Board actually has a really lovely diagram where they're showing how patients and members of the public can get involved in all areas of the research cycle, right from setting the research agenda all the way through to ensuring that you have an impact. The other thing is, because I started talking about engaged research and then moved into PPI, I think it's always useful to just show how these two terms actually fit together. And you can see that that PPI is almost, not quite, but almost embedded within engaged research. So the slight difference is that with PPI, what we're talking about is that the voices of patients, carers, and the public actually are at the research table, so that they are there, as decisions are being made. They're there in order to provide their input in some way that is meaningful, and it's useful to the process and is meaningful to them. With engaged research, what we are talking about is working with stakeholders. Now, sometimes the stakeholder is not going to be the patient themselves. It might be nurses working in a particular context. It might be the people who are managing the budgets for a particular area. It might be other stakeholders. It might just not be suitable or appropriate or even possible to include the voice of the patient within that. But you are engaging with stakeholders. And so most of the time, as I said, PPI fits very snugly within engaged research. The one slight difference is that sometimes you can do engaged research, but not have the voice of the patient at the table. So when we ask how can patients contribute to impact, I have two very quick examples here that you can take a look at from two colleagues of mine. One, Professor Deirdre Daly, who does the MAMI study on maternal health and maternal mortality. She developed what we would call a MOOC, a massive open online course in FutureLearn, based on the findings of MAMI, but working with mothers who actually played a part in the study itself. She put the call out to them and said, I want to develop this MOOC. I'd really love for you to work with me on this. And so some of the mothers then volunteered to work with her on it. And they developed this fantastic MOOC, which there's almost been 10,000 enrollments in it, that provides all kinds of really useful and practical information to young mothers. A second example, which really leans into the engaged research space, was the development of the National Intellectual Disability Memory Service in Tallaght. The person in the foreground here, my colleague Professor Mary McCarran, actually heads up the PPI in Trinity. But as well as that, she is the principal investigator on IDS Tilda, the intellectual disability supplement to Tilda itself. And that it was through the findings of Tilda that she actually brought together an awful lot of different stakeholders in this area. Not just the people you can see on screen here, such as Avista, what used to be the Daughters of Charity, Trinity, and Tallaght Hospital, but also people like the Federation for Voluntary Bodies, and also a lot of people with intellectual disabilities and families themselves, in order to move this forward, along with the National Dementia Office, to move this forward, firstly into a pilot stage, into the funding and development of a pilot stage, until ultimately then it made its way into an ongoing budget, so that it is now an established service within Tallaght. So I always think it's useful to, when we talk about research impact, it's always useful, particularly when you're talking about patients, is to say, well, whose impact is it anyway? Now, as a health professional, your impact may be one thing, as an academic researcher it may be another, but also we need to remember that the patient may also have impacts that they want to see and that they want to achieve. And you can see in this diagram that these are interlocking circles, and I appreciate that somebody can be all three of these things or can be one or other of them. But as a health professional, probably the things that are going through your mind are, well, of course, I know what impact is. It's about improving the services we deliver, or it's about better health outcomes, or it's about better budget allocations, or even it might be about delivering our policy imperatives. But that's not necessarily how a researcher defines impact. And actually, traditionally, researchers would have defined impact as, publishing books, journal articles, chapters. That would have been impact for them. That would have been their dissemination, would have been the impact that they were looking for, or their presentation at conferences and seminars and larger events. But actually, how impact gets defined and who, what impact gets to be articulated often depends on factors like the policy landscape, on what the funder wants. It depends on the organizational structure and how the organization understands impact. It depends on the ambition of the team and also the actual stated desired outcomes of the project itself. But what I think is really interesting is that funders are starting to ensure that they are communicating that when they talk about impact, what they want to see is they want to see change. They want to see a benefit, a contribution. And as you can see from Science Foundation Ireland and the Health Research Board, they're saying that we don't just want to change, we want a demonstrable or identifiable change or benefit. So in other words, it's not enough for there to have been a change. We want you to show us and to tell us that there has been a change as well. And you can see that in the HRB Payback framework, where they identify the kinds of impacts, you can see at the start of that, there's all those traditional things about peer-reviewed publications and citations. And these are important, and I'm not knocking these in any way. These are important in order to, to be the kind of the things that pass on this knowledge to other researchers so that each of us can build on the research of others. But what's also now in the framework is that they want to see how are you informing policy practice and product development? How are you actually contributing to population health and health sector benefits? And how are you actually impacting on the wider economy as well? So it's my sense that really it's in these areas that we'll now see more and more emphasis, that the other sides of it will almost be a given, but that what people will want to see is some kind of articulation of real impact. And because I work with patients and members of the public, I have to really raise the flag here and say, yes, okay, you've all got your impacts and you've all got your structures and your systems, but what about the patient? What about impact for the patient? How do they understand impact? How can they be facilitated to really grapple with impact and to come up with realistic ambitions and expectations for what can be involved? And so this is what we're grappling with in PPI Ignite in Trinity, so that we can come up with a national system that helps patients to articulate the impact that they want and the impact that they've seen. And a couple of models that I think are lovely examples here is there was one model from Ontario where they came up with this really lovely, straightforward 3 or 4 page document that patients could sit down with in order to articulate what kind of impact they wanted to see. And you can see that there's lots of great checklists there that give people suggestions about, yeah, well, we want to see a newspaper article, or yeah, well, we want there to be a conference or to be a media event or something like that. And it allows people the opportunity to start to articulate in particular ways what they would like to see, and it raises their expectations of what might be possible. And then at the far end of a project, and another Canadian example, the Canadians are great in this area, is about capturing the impact that did happen, that did exist, and that Research Impact Canada actually came up with a kind of an interview schedule that you can go through with patients and members of the public who've been involved in a project in order to um, actually get them to articulate what kind of change they saw and how they saw it. Because the thing is that the researcher, if they're looking at the particular kinds of impacts that the funder wants, and the clinician may be looking at other kinds of KPIs, that the articulation by the patient might be very different and actually might be very revealing and illuminating to everybody else. And certainly more and more funders want to hear from patients and members of the public about what kind of change they're seeing in the world. So just in conclusion, I'd like to acknowledge our funders, who are the HOB, the Irish Research Council, and also Trinity College themselves, who fund the Trinity PPI Ignite office. And I'd also like to acknowledge my colleague, Sarah Bowman, who I work very closely with in strategic engagement and impact assessment in Trinity.
Thank you so much, Michael. That was a really interesting overview of the work that you're doing, and particularly in relation to engaged research. But I think you've also given us an insight into the complexities of PPI as well, patient and public involvement. And we've got one comment and a question in the chat so far. Excellent presentation. Interesting to see the distinction between PPI and engaged research. Most research might include involvement of stakeholders. Does that make it engaged research, or is this the type of, or is it the type of involvement that's also important?
Well, I think what's really interesting about engaged research is the scope of it. And I think that some people have this idea that, well, you know, if we're talking about engaged research, it is really about involving people in absolutely every single part of the project at all stages. And I think that that's fine if that can be achieved, but it's often not possible to be able to do that. Sometimes because the person, you know, you're dealing with things that are you know, very esoteric. Let's say, like I always give the example with lab-based research. You're not going to have the patient sitting beside you in the lab, you know. Like what can they do in terms of the lab-based work if they're not a trained lab technician? So it's just not meaningful. What you're all the time looking for with stakeholders is you're looking to give them meaningful roles where the knowledge that they do have can actually make a difference in this. But the other side to it, and Kate, you'll probably speak to this as well, is the fact that people have other things to do as well in engaged research. So in other words, you know, if you're working with a senior civil servant on a project, they're not going to be able to necessarily attend a meeting every week for you to talk about, you know, what progress that you had on that. So the thing is that, you know, if you've got an assistant secretary who has agreed to be part of this research project, they're not going to want to come along every week. They're not going to want to stuff envelopes. They're not, you know, they're not good. You know, that the thing is, you're going to make best use of your stakeholders themselves. So I think it is a sophisticated and also very varied approach to research. But fundamentally, at the heart of it, what you want to see is you want to see stakeholders having an influence on what gets done, how it gets done, how it gets managed, and what kind of effect it can have. And also it not just getting to, not imagining that the publishing the findings is somehow the finish line of the research. In fact, you should only be halfway through. It's more like a triathlon rather than a, you know, a marathon. What you do is that once you get to the findings, we appreciate that it took a long time to get there, but actually you need to hop on the bike now and you need to turn that into something else.
That's a really good analogy. Actually, I just wanted to pick you up on something you said. You talked about meaningful engagement in your presentation. You just mentioned it again in your response then. And I wonder how we define meaningful and how we make engagement meaningful.
Um, I suppose uh, the practical example that I have, which is something that I do every week, is that um, the PPI Ignite office is actually based in the Trinity Centre for Aging and Intellectual Disability. So I have a colleague who is our ambassador liaison officer, who's a woman with Down syndrome. So meaningful engagement for her is shaped by the way in which we do things and the kind of insights that she can bring to that. So there's no point in somebody sitting down and giving her a lab protocol and say, "Can you give me your feedback on that?" Like, she's a very able woman, but she has no background in lab research or anything like that, or statistical analysis. So for somebody to ask her questions about that stuff is not meaningful. But for somebody to say, "I'm doing this research on this," as somebody who is living with Down syndrome, what do you think that make, how does that make sense to you? And to really listen and hear what it is she's saying has often had a profound effect on the way in which people do statistical analysis and the questions that they ask of the data. So I think the thing is, meaningful it's a kind of a double-edged sword, that there are tasks that you need to do in research, but that the way in which you tackle those tasks and the way in which you ensure that the voices of patients, members of the public, carers can actually influence and affect that, you need to develop that skill in order to make that work and make it happen. But on the other side to it, in order to keep people coming back for more, they also need to feel like they are being treated with respect, that they are having a meaningful role. And actually, one of the things that we've been working on in Trinity as part of the PPI Ignite network is a set of values and principles that will really, we hope anyway, really increase and improve the level of excellence in public and patient involvement. And the reason why that's based on values is that we think that there is a point here about how you treat people well, and how the absence of values can really uh, unfortunately drive people away from PPI. And of course we end up losing all of that fantastic insight, and we end up just with people who will keep trudging on despite how terrible it is. We don't want that. We want people to have a meaningful experience with us. And that is subjective. And I appreciate that it is subjective as to what is meaningful for different people. But we also have to be careful. We don't want to just have these kind of superhuman people who, despite all of the odds, still keep managing to turn up. We want people we want to build an environment, I think, all of the time where people feel that they can be involved, and that they can also do things like that they can drop out and drop back in again. If I've got a mental health issue, there might be times where I need to take a month off and I need to come back to a process. And I've seen that. I've seen people with schizophrenia who've been involved in research projects where potentially they had to go away for a month, and that they said that was the best thing about it, that they could come back into the process and feel that a space was still there for them, and that they could pick up where they left off. So I think that there's always that thing about meaningful. What's meaningful to you as a researcher? What's meaningful to the person themselves? And how you can negotiate that and build that together.
Thanks very much, Michael. There's a couple of other questions, but I may come back to those after Kate's spoken, and maybe both of you can respond to that. So thank you very much. That's been really, really insightful and helpful. So our second speaker this morning is Kate Morris from the Irish Universities Association. And Kate's going to talk about another important aspect of engagement and discuss how academia can and does interact with the public sector, including practitioners, policymakers, politicians, and how we all might do that better by forming ongoing, mutually beneficial relationships. So Kate, you're very welcome, and we look forward to listening to your presentation.
It's a very sincere thank you for the invitation to speak here today. It's a great privilege, and I'm really grateful to share some of this insight with such an important community of researchers. The researchers across the HSE are a vital mobilizer within the health system to get what works in for patients and service providers, clinicians across the board. And thanks to Michael Foley for linking in with me to be here. Michael is an absolute joy to work with. So just to recognise all the work Michael and his colleague Sarah Bowman do in this space. So I'm going to grab your attention for 10, 12 minutes and talk about this. I guess at a kind of a micro or a macro level of what we've been trying to do within Campus Engage. So Campus Engage is based in the Irish Universities Association. And the Irish Universities Association is where the 8 presidents of the 8 universities come together and strategize and plan around policy, practice change, and ultimately to make sure that the higher education system is fit for purpose. And they engage very strategically with the core, with government and other partners to get things done. So this presentation is about looking at this whole area of engaged research in terms of societal challenges. So ultimately, we are living through, I'm just trying to change my slide here, here we go. We are living in a society that is riddled with very complex, wicked societal challenges that our researchers are working to address. So I'm going to talk about PPI and engaged research from a kind of a broader societal, global, European, Irish perspective. So we flick on our telly, right? And every day we open the newspapers and, you know, we've just come out of a pandemic and we're looking for light relief, but we're not getting it. Yeah. So, and this is something that government are highly aware of in terms of their role and their remit as policy officials to address these societal challenges. So housing, can our younger generation ever begin to imagine to own a house? The planet is warming up, has a detrimental effect on our biodiversity. And of course, why we're here today is to think about the health service provision across Ireland and what we can do in terms of engaged research to support better services across the system. Of course, there's an energy crisis, and the knock-on effect of that energy crisis is a cost of living crisis for Irish within society. And the issue here for SFI, for the Irish Research Council, for the HRB, for Irish Government, for the European Commission is we're putting a huge amount of money and funding into the system, into research and innovation, and things are moving very slow in terms of addressing these societal challenges. And we don't have the luxury of time, a lot of money going in, and this is creating frustration, but also a sense of public apathy or kind of, you know, feeling bootless, useless. What's my role as a citizen, as a non-citizen, as a member of society, and how can I get involved in addressing these great and serious societal challenges? And today we're looking particularly in terms of the health system, health sector, health services. So we present in Campus Engage, engaged research and innovation as one of the core factors in the system and in this particular field to address and tackle these wicked, complex societal challenges. We talk about wicked problems. It means that there's so many stakeholders. Again, Michael talked about that issue of values. I think this is so fundamental in terms of all of what we're doing in this space. So one individual's values might be quite radically different to another individual's values. And then there's a debate and negotiation around whose values matter. And often with these complex societal challenges, when you take an action in one area, it means that you're also negatively impacting others in another space. So it's very complex, lots of individuals involved in trying to address these societal challenges through research and innovation, and including our public health service and associated practices. So engaged research and innovation. What's it all about? Michael very beautifully discussed the whole area of public patient involvement, which is a vital space in this core kind of umbrella. We look at engaged research and innovation as a kind of an umbrella terminology where we can kind of bring everybody on, get everybody involved and feel like they have a role to play. And that includes all beneficiaries of research and innovation, including patients, but also including policy officials, including service providers, clinicians, practitioners, citizens, you know, across citizen science, that whole agenda. But the fundamental piece about engaged research and innovation is that you're bringing the beneficiaries into the conversation about what your research and innovation project wants to address. So you're not factoring them in for at the end of the mobilization piece. You're bringing them in when you're beginning to think about the research question. Okay, so what is it? What is our actual research question here? And what are the actions we need to take throughout the research cycle? They're being involved in that process as well. They might be out collecting data. They might be evaluating the implementation of the research project. Are the immediate actions still viable, necessary, and how they work with the project team in order to deliver. So bringing in those research beneficiaries at the right stage where they're appropriate to bring in, to also collectively understand what outcomes want to be achieved and what impact ultimately this project needs to address. So it's bringing the beneficiaries in to understand the cause and the necessary effect of a research project. So the cause of a societal challenge, and then the necessary effect we want to see a research project deliver on. So it's also really fundamental to the European agenda, and also Science Foundation Ireland and IORC's research calls, and HRB, of course, is this transdisciplinary approach. And what this means, again, is getting your immunologists to work with citizens, with non-citizens, with general society, but also working with industry, with policy officials. But there's also the complexity here is that we need our engineers and our immunologists to be working with manufacturers, and it's all this kind of complex way of looking. It's bringing all the people to the party to understand how we can deliver a research project to get effect. And nowhere did we see that more fantastically was through COVID, and I'll mention that a little later. The other big issue here is we're only telling half the story when we talk about societal impact at the moment. How the system, how government talks about the impact of research and innovation. They're talking about IP, intellectual property, licenses, new jobs. And what we want to do through Campus Engage and with Trinity and the HSE and all collectively is to talk about the societal impact, how research is changing people's lives on the ground, how a new program or a new service generated from research has really impacted positively their lives. So that's a specific piece where we're trying to work on in terms of being able to gather data and information, both stories and numbers, about the societal impact of research and innovation, including public-patient involvement in research. So ultimately, what we're trying to do with the engaged research and innovation agenda is get there faster, right? So we want to find solutions, create impact, positive impact. But getting people on board, our pitch is that it's saving time, saving money, and it is accelerating the impact process. So understanding what will work and what won't work throughout the research and innovation process by bringing in those core stakeholders or the beneficiaries is really important. The good news out in the system is what we're talking about, and we're pushing the agenda. It's building political momentum. And actually, I would argue that the momentum is now, it's there, it's arrived. It's not only a requirement for Horizon funding and SFI challenge funding, for example. I was presented at the opening of the SFI summit last week, so it's another indicator that this is a big agenda item on the research and innovation field. But it is societal challenge funding within SFI is engaged research, full stop. You can't actually get the funding for any of these challenge-based funding calls across Horizon Europe or SFI unless you're actually working with research beneficiaries from ideation, through think design, through all of these different processes of bringing in the research beneficiaries into the process. So that's good news. Also, this is all about, when policy officials want to talk about this, what is the added advantage? Well, the added advantage is this is giving Ireland a kind of a competitive edge in terms of Horizon Europe funding. And we're this little island off the west coast of Europe. But what's great about our island and our system and where we are today is that we're very interconnected. If you genuinely want to go off and talk to a principal officer or assistant sec gen within the Department of Further Higher Education, or I'd argue even within the Department of Health, or certainly Department of Community Rural Development, Department of Education. It's easy to access these individuals, and we've a lot of open consultations as well. So we are connected. So I would argue that the higher education system, the department officials, the research funding agencies are connected, and they can see the benefit through this dialogue of this process and this approach to research. We have our new Department of Further Higher Education, and within their most recent Research and Innovation Strategy 2030, this is really embedded in that through the Creating Our Futures report and the objectives of that. It's all about engagement with citizens, engagement with non-citizens and others, public patient, in the research process. We have our new Evidence for Public Policy unit within the department, and their role, so the role of Deirdre Lillis and Trudy and Leonora and others, is all about connecting our research innovators within the higher education system to work closer with policy officials in government. And this is connected into the whole public service reform agenda that's coming from the Department of An Taoiseach. So really better using funding and instruments at a European level to better support our civil servants, our policy officials, to connect and work better with our researchers across the system to inform implementable, fit-for-purpose policy for including health research. So I think that is one of the greatest advancements in the last year, is the opening of this unit. And they're doing extraordinary work trying to bring in all the various officials from the various departments and get buy-in to this process of connecting the dots across the research system, the policy making system, and the policy implementation process. Creating Our Futures, as I mentioned, this is really part of the bigger picture and how we're going to implement the recommendations from the Creating Our Future project. And a quick recap: this was initiated by Science Foundation Ireland to get out, and they got something like 80,000 plus responses from public, very short, pithy responses on what they want research and innovation to address through public budget, public taxpayers' money. And of course, the health services was right up the top of that, including mental health, well-being in that as a subsection. So, and then finally, we have the Societal Challenges funding instrument through Science Foundation Ireland. And also to note that Science Foundation Ireland are going to be merging, for want of a better word, with the Irish Research Council in the near future. I think it's by 2023 that'll have to have happened, so changes in legislation. But to bring both of these organisations together, increasing budget, and of course it'll have to have a title change. But really, what we're hoping for out of that is a positioning the arts, humanities, social science on equal footing to science, technology, engineering, and maths, but also getting much greater levels of interdisciplinary research across the board in funding calls and funding of research and innovation project implementation. So some exciting movements across the system, and this has really only happened in the last kind of 12-18 months. So good news there. So just to bring your attention to the role of researchers and innovators in this whole space of addressing societal challenges, and our researchers on the call today from the HSE. And we envisaged researchers and the innovators as kind of the gateway or the brokers between society and evidence-informed policy making particularly. And this is an area that is gaining greater momentum in terms of funding calls, and specifically at the European Horizon Europe level. So they want far greater engagement between researchers and not only civil society through the research process, but again, to get those findings and to be able to mobilize those findings into public policy. So evidence-informed public policy that is fit for purpose, implementable, and to be evaluating that implementation of public policy to be changing and chopping when and if necessary, based on engagement with the beneficiaries of public policy and research. So exciting times ahead in that space. So it's really about those researchers getting those findings, involving public patient in the research process, and bringing those findings to policy officials so they can write fit for purpose policy and put the money behind what matters to the public. So this is all great, but there's still a huge amount to be done across the system. So we've got lovely policy written for research, innovation, and engagement and involvement across HRB funding calls, SFI funding calls, Irish Research Council funding calls, and again, Horizon Europe. But there's a lot of work to do in order to get things up to scratch. And I would argue the first thing that has to happen is at a leadership level across our universities, across our funding agencies, who I think have taken big advancement in this space, but also across government agencies and departments, is this kind of cultural and attitudinal change to the importance of building in the research beneficiaries into the research agenda. And across the higher education system and other systems levels, we need to build the infrastructures within the universities. So we have these wonderful tech transfer units within universities, but equally they need to look at the roles and responsibilities of colleagues and staff, building leadership, building capacity, competency, excellence in this space, and to change and reimagine the roles of colleagues and staff across the system. So they are mobilizers of research to support not only public policy informing, but also systems building programs, early intervention prevention programs out of research findings, building capacity, competency, and so on. And that's the final one of the point here, is the actual building capacity across all stakeholder groups. So, and what we're trying to do in Campus Engage is to do that. And I'll talk very briefly here on the work of an amazing colleague, Professor Derek O'Keefe. So Derek is kind of one of Science Foundation Ireland's kind of case studies on how to do this and how to do it well. So Derek has worked for years with, for a number of years with the Mayo Clinic. He's worked in Harvard. He's based now in Coram, the SFI Centre in Galway, University of Galway, and he's a big avid supporter of public patient involvement. And he mainly looks at this there's his colleagues and his team in University Hospital Galway. And what Derek Nora mainly focuses on is bringing patients into developing new products, new services, and new programs to deliver patient goods and services. But bringing those people into the research and innovation process, as discussed or mentioned earlier, through the Engage Research process. And Derek featured on our RTE Changemaker series and his work with Michelle. And so he was working with Michelle in order to provide a different type of product in terms of navigating, whether in streets, shops, a new, rather than the white stick, some kind of easy to use, apply, sensory product for getting around and day-to-day situations. So really Michelle co-built and co-designed this new product with Derek. Equally, he's working with community groups across the Aran Islands and in the west of Ireland. So during extensive flooding back in 2018, Derek would have engaged with specifically people out on the very west coast of Ireland and also on the Aran Islands about thinking about new ways to deliver medication to the community. And originally in his initial work with these communities and these individuals, there was kickback, thinking that they were going to lose their practitioners and their health service providers on the islands, and they didn't want to get involved. But once you really brought them into the research and innovation process to get them to understand this is actually an additional benefit to you guys, it will not impact whatsoever your current services, but this is about using drones in this case to deliver medication quicker, faster, saving time, saving energy, saving money to the community on the islands. And just phenomenal work taking place with across the west coast of Ireland. And this is another system you put in place for virtual consultation and remote monitoring of patients with diabetes. So just quick look at Derek's work there as a little case study of real excellence of how the SFI community and University of Galway are working with very local community organisations, public, patient, to improve products, services, and general provision of services at a systems level in the west of Ireland. Bringing your attention back to Campus Engage and what we're trying to do in terms of building capacity for change. So for change on the ground. Myself, Michael, Sarah have over the years been working together to build a capacity building training offer to specifically for researchers within higher education institutions, but also we'd be delighted to get a HSE researcher to come on board this iteration of a 6-week train the trainer course on engaged research and innovation for societal impact. This came out of a national consultation we did with researchers, with civil society organisations. We got the WHEEL members involved and colleagues across the European Commission projects and in the UK to feed into a national consultation to build an engaged research framework that basically could provide clear definitions of what engaged research is and a framework on how to do engaged research. So we have just relaunched this capacity building programme that has spun out from that original engaged research project and funded originally by Irish Research Council, Enterprise Ireland and Science Foundation Ireland. And this iteration, we've teamed up with the HEA and specifically the Joint Research Centre, the European Commission Joint Research Centre, who have wonderful people who've helped us to grade our existing programme to embed European Horizon Europe key criteria in the course, the second iteration of this course. So it's been built with all of the key voices across the research funding agency, so leaders, so Grania in the Irish Research Council, Anna in HRB, who's a major advocate, and Anna Cody within the HRB for public patient involvement, Lisa Keating, who leads the Science Foundation Ireland challenge-based funding calls, EPA, Royal Irish Academy, Enterprise Ireland, THEA, and of course our friends, Avril and others in the Health Research Charities Group Ireland. So these are our new partners across the system. And this is a lovely photo of all the people we trained in 2022. So these are all new trainers in engaged research and innovation, now embedded in SFI centres, in university research development units, in Sustainable Energy Ireland, in the WHEEL. And this is all open access. This is about empowering new leaders in this space and trainers. So we'd be delighted to get a HSE researcher involved this year to be an ambassador and a leader in terms of engaged research for Ireland. So that's it. A quick thank you for all of you for listening. It's a kind of a short and snappy overview of what we're doing, really, I guess, in terms of at a macro level to shift attitudes, culture and practice on the ground in terms of engaged research.
Thanks very much, Kate. That was an excellent and informative presentation in terms of engaged research and also building partnerships and building capacity across the system. We've probably only got time maybe for two questions. But one of the things I'd like to ask you about, we undertook a survey across HSE in the summer, and some of the feedback was that researchers find engaging with potential knowledge users was a problem. And I wonder if you have any advice for that knowledge mobilization process.
I'll just give a quick response to that, and it is problematic. And Michael, as a kind of on the ground practitioner, it's been a number of years now since I've been working hands-on in data collection as a researcher. But I think it's about getting to know your research users at a very kind of one-to-one level and getting to really build relationships, building trust. So that means that you've got to get up out of your seat, get onto boards, get onto committees, get onto non-governmental organization, get to their events, not only academic events, get to their AGMs as a guest, get to their their conferences that are academic. A lot of these organizations, non-governmental organizations, public patient representation organizations, have brilliant researchers working for them. And they've got their gateways into meet your research users. And then it's that kind of classic research snowball effect of how you gather more of those same individuals from that cohort that you want to engage with. But the fundamental thing is having a value-based approach. As Michael talked about, I think that is such a really important piece, and that you very are openly expressive about the values you bring to your the values that are embedded in the research process that you're offering people to come part of. But trust, again, building the trust is vital. But my experience of the last 20 years are people are very keen to get involved and have a voice, but by doing it in a very open and an empathetic and welcoming way, it is vital.
And I would absolutely concur with that. I think the thing is that, yeah, you have to turn up and you have to chat to the person sitting beside you. You know, I mean, it's as simple and as straightforward as that. That you chat to the person beside you, it turns out that they're a friend of such and such then knows such and such. So it's as simple and as straightforward as conversation by conversation. You find your way towards the people who either sign the checks or make the decisions. But the other part to it is, and this really came up when we ran the course, was that people didn't really understand how the infrastructure, the public sector infrastructure worked. And that it really, a lot of the feedback we got from people was that they were so delighted that we spent 2 sessions on who's who in the public sector. What do they do? How does it work? How do things get made within the public sector? How do you create kind of care pathways and things like that? And even that, having that knowledge, I think, is really, really useful and helpful. Not in terms of saying, how do I get to sit down with the minister, but how do I get to sit down with that particular civil servant who has at the top of their agenda right now the need to write this piece of legislation or this particular piece of work, in order to feed that into something else that will go into something else that will go into something else. And that actually, so rather than trying to knock on the minister's door and not really getting anywhere, how do you actually play a lot smarter in terms of making the changes that need to be made and stitching things into policy and practice?
Yeah, I see Carol Farrell, just as I see Carol Farrell is on as a participant. Carol Farrell, I would have worked with Carol years ago and she was leading on with us on the Engaged Research Agenda. There is somebody within the health service system who has real insights on all of this space. So yeah, just a little hello to Carol.
Thanks very much. I'd love to continue the conversation and certainly talk some more about impact and how we define impact, but sadly we've run out of time. So thank you very much again, both Kate and Michael, for that really informative morning's discussion really about engaged research. So thank you very much, because I'm sure we've learned an awful lot from you both this morning. So